Canada lives because of the United States. That's what Donald Trump told the world. And Mark Carney, he looked Trump dead in the eye and said something that should terrify every American strategist in Washington. Canada doesn't exist because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. But here's what kept me up last night. This isn't about pride. This isn't about rhetoric. This is about the fact that 40 million Americans wake up every single morning drinking water that flows through Canadian territory and the water system they depend on. It generates $6 trillion in economic activity every year. Not million, not billion. $6 trillion. Trump thinks he's negotiating from strength with tariffs and annexation threats. But what I'm about to show you is how Canada controls something Trump can't replace, can't import, and absolutely cannot take by force. Wait, it gets worse. While Trump was threatening to slash Great Lakes funding by 90% while he was talking about his very large faucet that could divert Canadian water to California, Canada was sitting on legal authority they've had since 2001 that gives them complete control over who gets Great Lakes water and who doesn't. The Great Lakes aren't just lakes. They're the largest freshwater system on Earth. Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, Ontario. Together, they hold 6 quadrillion gallons of water. That's 21% of the world's surface freshwater in 5 interconnected lakes that straddle the United States-Canada border. For generations, nobody questioned who controlled this water because there was so much of it that scarcity seemed impossible. American cities built infrastructure assuming unlimited access. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Buffalo. Millions of people are depending on water they assumed would always flow. American agriculture across 8 states irrigated crops, knowing Great Lakes water would always be available. Manufacturing throughout the Midwest used lake water for everything from steel production to food processing to chemical plants. All of it was built around the assumption that water access was permanent. Here's what nobody's talking about. The Great Lakes region operates as its own economy. If it were a country, it would be the 3rd largest economy in the world with a GDP of $6 trillion. That's bigger than Germany, bigger than Japan, 3rd only to the United States and China. But that $6 trillion economy, it depends entirely on consistent water availability. Without it, manufacturing stops, agriculture collapses, cities face crisis, and there are no alternatives. You can't replace Great Lakes water with imports. You can't substitute it with something else. You can't synthesize it at scale. This is the part that changes everything. Half the Great Lakes Basin sits in Canadian territory. The water that feeds American cities flows through Canadian soil. The lakes that American industry depends on pass through Canadian jurisdiction. And unlike oil or minerals or agricultural products, water is literally irreplaceable. Now here's where it gets complicated. Because Trump has been talking about Canadian water since his campaign, he stood in California and talked about this very large faucet in British Columbia that could be turned on to send water south. He told reporters he'd seen it. He described it as massive, taking a whole day to turn. Canadian water experts immediately called this nonsense. There is no giant faucet. There is no infrastructure to divert Canadian water directly to California. The Columbia River flows through American territory. Yes, but redirecting it would require treaties Canada has zero interest in signing. But Trump kept pushing. He suggested during his first term that California should accept water coming from the north. He claimed they'd have so much water they wouldn't know what to do with it. He blamed California's wildfires on refusing to take Canadian water, which he insisted was available. And then Trump threatened something that changed Canada's calculation entirely. He talked openly about annexing Canada as the 51st state. He referred to Justin Trudeau as Governor Trudeau instead of the Prime Minister. He suggested Canadian resources combined with American military power would make a perfect combination. This is the moment everything shifted, because when Trump started threatening Canadian sovereignty over trade disputes, when he started suggesting Canada's resources belong to America, when he made clear he saw Canada as territory to be absorbed, rather than a partner to be respected, Canada stopped worrying about damaging relationships and started thinking about leverage. And the leverage they have is water, specifically legal authority over Great Lakes water that American cities and industries absolutely require to function. In 2001, Canada amended the International Boundary Waters Treaty Act. The law explicitly prohibits the bulk removal of water from boundary waters shared with the United States. That includes the Great Lakes. That includes any proposal to pipe water outside the basin. That includes commercial export schemes. The ban was designed to stop companies from shipping Great Lakes water overseas. But the legal framework gives Canada something far more powerful: authority to control what happens to water in their jurisdiction, even when that water flows into American territory. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture, because while Trump was busy slashing Great Lakes protection funding by 90%, while American states were watching their water infrastructure deteriorate from budget cuts, Canada maintained its legal framework and its territorial authority over half the basin. Trump thought he was demonstrating American dominance. Instead, he revealed American dependence. And every threat he made gave Canada political cover to use the leverage it had been hesitant to deploy. This is the strategic nightmare American policymakers feared but never expected. An ally that controls critical resources is becoming willing to use them as leverage because American pressure made cooperation seem more dangerous than confrontation. But that's not even the real story. Here's what nobody's talking about. 2 days ago at Davos, Mark Carney stood in front of the world's most powerful leaders and declared that the old world order is over. Not changing, not evolving, over. It's not coming back, he said. He didn't mention Trump by name. He didn't need to, because when Carney talked about great powers using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, and financial infrastructure as coercion, every single person in that room knew exactly who he was describing. Carney told middle powers like Canada they shouldn't mourn the changing status quo. He said nostalgia isn't a strategy. And then he laid out a vision where countries like Canada build something bigger, better, stronger by standing up to economic coercion from superpowers. The applause was immediate, a standing ovation, because Carney just said out loud what dozens of other countries were thinking but didn't have the courage to articulate. Now, this is where it gets interesting because Trump was watching, and Trump does not handle public criticism well. Within hours, Trump fired back. He told the Davos crowd that Canada gets a lot of freebies from the United States and should be grateful. He watched Carney's speech and said the Canadian Prime Minister wasn't so grateful. And then Trump said the line that revealed everything: Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, before you make your statements. Let me be clear about what just happened. The President of the United States publicly threatened an ally for daring to suggest that economic coercion by great powers might be problematic. He essentially said, "Nice country you have there, Mark. Would be a shame if something happened to it." But here's what Trump doesn't understand. When you threaten a country's sovereignty this openly, when you suggest their entire existence depends on your goodwill, you don't create compliance. You create resolve. Carney responded immediately. He returned to Canada and delivered a filmed address that should be required viewing for anyone trying to understand what's actually happening here. Canada does not live because of the United States, Carney said. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. And then Carney reminded Trump of something the American president apparently forgot. We are masters of our home. This is our own country. It's our future. The choice is up to us. Trump's reaction: he withdrew Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace, the Gaza Reconstruction Board that Trump envisions as a potential rival to the United Nations. Canada had expressed interest in joining. Trump pulled the invitation and posted on Truth Social that Canada was no longer welcome. This is classic Trump. When challenged, when embarrassed, when confronted with the reality that other countries won't simply submit to American demands, he retaliates personally and publicly. But here's where Trump's strategy falls apart. Because the more he threatens, the more political support Carney gets domestically for standing firm. Every insult, every attempt to humiliate Canada, every suggestion that Canadian sovereignty is negotiable drives Canadian public opinion further towards supporting whatever leverage their government has. And the leverage Canada has is water. Let me show you what this actually means. The Great Lakes support more than 1.3 million jobs that generate $82 billion in wages annually. That's just direct employment. The total economic activity approaches $6 trillion when you count manufacturing, shipping, energy production, agriculture, tourism, and every other industry that depends on consistent water availability. American agriculture in the Great Lakes states produces $56 billion in crops annually. All of it is irrigated with water that passes through Canadian territory. Without that water, farming across the Midwest faces the same catastrophic shortages as those hitting the Southwest. American manufacturing uses Great Lakes water for steel production in Indiana and Ohio, automotive plants throughout Michigan, chemical facilities along Lake Erie, and food processing across the basin. These aren't industries that can relocate. They're built around water access that doesn't exist anywhere else. American energy generation relies on lake water for cooling nuclear and coal plants. American shipping moves hundreds of billions in cargo annually through the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway. All of it operates with the understanding that water will always be available. Except that understanding just changed, because what we're learning is that Trump's budget proposal includes slashing Great Lakes protection and remediation funding by 90%. 90. He wants to cut nearly all federal spending on maintaining the water system that supports $6 trillion in economic activity. Wait, it gets worse. Trump's budget cuts come while American states are already struggling with declining lake levels from climate change. Evaporation is accelerating. Precipitation patterns are shifting. The balance that sustained the Great Lakes for thousands of years is breaking. Meanwhile, Canada maintains its water protection infrastructure. Canadian provinces continue funding the monitoring and conservation programs that ensure long-term water security. While Trump cuts, Canada invests. Now here's the strategic calculation that should terrify Washington. Canada faces a choice. They can continue cooperating with American access to shared water resources despite Trump's threats and budget cuts. Or they can point to American policy failures and tighten their own regulations to protect Canadian interests first. Guess which option Carney's Davos speech suggests he's considering? Because when great powers use economic integration as weapons, when they treat middle powers as subordinates rather than partners, when they threaten sovereignty over trade disputes, middle powers start prioritizing their own security over cooperative relationships. Trump demanded that Carney show gratitude. What he got instead was a reminder that Canada controls something America desperately needs. Unlike agricultural products, minerals, or manufactured goods, water cannot be replaced. This is leverage, real tangible leverage that cannot be countered by tariffs, trade restrictions, or military threats. Because you can't invade an ally over water access. You can't bomb infrastructure that supplies your own cities. You can't threaten nuclear war over lake levels. Every major American city on the Great Lakes now operates, knowing its water supply flows through Canadian territory. Chicago depends on Lake Michigan. Detroit relies on the Detroit River connecting Lake St. Clair to Lake Erie, and Cleveland, Milwaukee, and Buffalo, all of which draw water from lakes that Canada has legal authority over. And what we're seeing is Trump's rhetoric driving Canada toward using that authority in ways previous Canadian governments avoided. Here's what nobody's talking about. The American Southwest is dying of thirst. The Colorado River doesn't reach the ocean anymore. California aquifers that took thousands of years to fill are being drained in decades. Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico face catastrophic water shortages. Politicians in these states started asking, why should the Great Lakes hold trillions of gallons while the Southwest collapses? Why can't water-rich regions share with water-poor ones? Engineering studies showed it was technically feasible to pipeline Great Lakes water westward. Political coalitions formed. Economic analyses demonstrated the investments would pay off by preventing regional collapse. The proposals all assumed Great Lakes water was available. Maybe expensive, maybe politically difficult, but ultimately available because the water exists, and Americans in need should access American resources. Here's the problem. The Great Lakes aren't just American resources. They're shared with Canada. And Canada was watching American states plan to drain shared water for unilateral benefit, while Canadian communities face their own water security challenges. Reports are coming in that every proposal hit the same legal barrier: Canada's 2001 ban on bulk water exports. The law is explicit. Water cannot leave the Great Lakes Basin without approval from both federal and provincial governments. That includes bottled water, industrial transfers, and any scheme to pipeline water to states outside the basin. Canada has veto power over American water projects. Now, here's where it gets complicated. American states argued that water flowing through American territory belongs to America. That domestic water policy is a sovereign American decision. But the Great Lakes aren't domestic. They're international. Half the basin sits in Canadian jurisdiction. The St. Lawrence Seaway runs entirely through Canadian territory. Niagara Falls sits on the border with Canadian control over flow rates. If Canada restricted the flow or diverted water away from American access points, there's no countermeasure. You cannot force a sovereign nation to provide water access. You cannot negotiate water treaties at gunpoint. This is the strategic reality Trump refuses to acknowledge. American dependence on Canadian water creates vulnerability that cannot be eliminated through economic pressure or military superiority. Documents reveal Western state governors reacted with fury. They accused Canada of hoarding resources during a crisis. They demanded negotiations. They pressured Washington to force Canadian cooperation. But here's what makes this different. Water isn't fungible. You cannot import it from other regions at a reasonable cost. You cannot synthesize it. You cannot substitute something else. If Canada says no, American states outside the basin have no alternatives. The Southwest continues collapsing. Agriculture fails, cities face an existential crisis, and Washington can do nothing to change Canada's decision. Sources confirm this reality is driving panic in states that counted on Great Lakes water as backup. Nevada built projections around accessing the Great Lakes supply. Arizona developed infrastructure proposals assuming Canadian cooperation. California lobbied Congress for funding based on Great Lakes access. All of it is now uncertain because Trump's threats convince Canada that protecting its own water security matters more than accommodating American demands. But wait, it gets worse. Climate change is accelerating this crisis faster than anyone projected. The latest information shows Great Lakes water levels dropping from increased evaporation and reduced precipitation. Warmer temperatures mean less ice cover, which increases evaporation. Rainfall patterns are shifting. The balance that sustained the system for millennia is breaking. Here's what nobody's talking about. Less than 1% of Great Lakes water is naturally renewed each year through precipitation. Everything beyond that is essentially fossil water from ancient glaciers. You're not turning on a tap. You're mining a finite resource. The International Joint Commission concluded years ago that the Great Lakes are fully allocated. If you account for all existing uses, there is never a surplus available for new extraction. Every drop currently flowing to American cities, farms, and factories represents maximum sustainable yield. Any additional removal threatens the entire system. Now, here's the twist Trump didn't see coming. While American states planned massive extraction projects and Trump slashed protection funding, Canada maintained conservative water management policies, prioritizing long-term sustainability over short-term gain. Canadian provinces restrict water permits. Canadian federal law prohibits bulk exports. Canadian water agencies invest in monitoring and conservation. All are designed to ensure Canadian communities have water security even as climate change reduces availability. This creates strategic asymmetry. Canada planned for scarcity. America assumed abundance. And when Trump threatened Canadian sovereignty, he gave Canada every reason to prioritize Canadian interests over American access. What we're seeing is the political shift that makes this leverage operational. For years, Canadian governments avoided using the water authority aggressively because doing so would damage relationships with their largest trading partner. But Trump changed that calculation. When relationships are already damaged, when the ally openly threatens annexation, and when economic coercion becomes explicit American policy, why maintain cooperation that benefits American interests at Canadian expense? Carney campaigned on elbows up, a hockey term meaning defensive posture. He won the election promising to stand up to Trump's threats. And standing up to Trump means using whatever leverage Canada has. The Great Lakes give Canada leverage that Trump cannot counter. Unlike trade, where America's larger economy provides negotiating power, water creates dependency, flowing in the opposite direction. American cities need Canadian water. American agriculture needs Canadian water. American industry needs Canadian water. And there are no alternatives, no substitutes, no way to eliminate dependence, short of abandoning the entire Great Lakes economic corridor. Trump wanted to prove American dominance. Instead, he revealed American vulnerability. And every escalation makes Canada more willing to use the leverage that actually works. This is what keeps me up at night. $6 trillion. That's annual economic activity in the Great Lakes corridor, not total wealth. Annual activity depending on consistent water availability. Manufacturing accounts for roughly $2 trillion. Agriculture generates $56 billion. Shipping adds over $30 billion. Energy, tourism, and fishing make up hundreds of billions more, all operating on the assumption that water will always be available. Remove that assumption, and the entire economic structure becomes uncertain. Now, here's what makes this strategic. Canada isn't threatening to drain the lakes. Carney isn't planning to divert water from American cities, but the legal authority exists. And American industries now face the reality that their operations depend on continued Canadian cooperation. This is leverage, real leverage, that cannot be countered by tariffs, trade restrictions, or military threats. Water is too essential, too irreplaceable, too geographically concentrated in Canadian jurisdiction. If Trump escalates trade wars, Canada can respond by tightening environmental regulations, reducing the water available for American industrial use. If states push for extraction projects, Canada can unilaterally reject them regardless of pressure. If Washington threatens Canadian sovereignty, Carney can point to the Great Lakes and remind Trump that 40 million Americans depend on water flowing through Canadian territory. Officials are now saying climate change is making water scarcity the defining resource challenge of the 21st century. The Southwest is already collapsing. The Great Lakes represent the largest remaining freshwater reserve in North America. Every state facing a water crisis is looking at those lakes, wondering how to gain access. Political pressure to override Canadian authority will intensify as American shortages worsen. But here's what changes everything. Canada just demonstrated it won't yield. The 2001 export ban has overwhelming domestic support. Every province touching the Great Lakes backs it. Federal commitment is absolute. Water stays in Canada unless Canada agrees otherwise. American states can negotiate. They can offer partnerships, infrastructure, investments, and shared environmental protections. What they cannot do is demand access or threaten consequences if Canada refuses. That fundamentally changes North American water politics. For generations, water was treated as abundant and accessible. Scarcity was a problem for other regions. The Great Lakes meant security. Now the Great Lakes are leverage, and Canada just showed they're willing to use it when American pressure threatens Canadian interests. Trump threatened Canadian trade, assuming agriculture was Canada's vulnerability. He imposed tariffs, expecting farmers to pressure Ottawa. He suggested annexation, expecting Canada to have no alternatives. What we're learning is that Trump made a fundamental miscalculation. Canada isn't economically dependent on the United States in ways that create one-sided vulnerability. Canada controls resources that the United States absolutely requires. And when Trump escalated pressure, he gave Canada political cover to weaponize those resources. American cities need Canadian water. American agriculture needs Canadian water. American industry needs Canadian water. No alternatives, no substitutes, no way to eliminate dependence short of abandoning the entire Great Lakes region. Carney didn't invent this leverage. It always existed, but previous Canadian governments avoided using it because doing so would damage relationships and escalate conflicts. Trump's threats change that calculation. If relationships are already damaged and conflicts already escalated, why not use the leverage that actually works? The result is that Trump faces an opponent he cannot pressure economically without triggering responses that hurt American interests more than Canadian ones. Every tariff risks retaliation against water access. Every threat invites tightening of resource controls. Every escalation makes Canada more willing to prioritize its own interests over American demands. This is the strategic nightmare American policymakers feared but never expected. An ally that controls critical resources is becoming willing to use them as leverage because American pressure made cooperation seem more dangerous than confrontation. Now here's what nobody's talking about. Trump wanted to prove American dominance. Instead, he revealed American dependence. And every city, farm, and factory along the Great Lakes now understands its water flows through Canadian territory on Canadian terms. The $6 trillion Great Lakes corridor isn't locked yet, but Canada just installed the locks, handed the keys to Mark Carney, and made clear that access depends on respect for Canadian sovereignty. And there's nothing Trump can do except watch the water flow and hope Canada chooses to keep cooperating because the alternative is unthinkable. 40 million Americans are depending on water they cannot secure through force. $6 trillion in economic activity is dependent on Canadian goodwill, industries that cannot relocate, cities that cannot adapt, and agriculture that cannot survive without the resource Canada controls. Trump told Carney that Canada lives because of the United States. But what we're seeing is the opposite. The American Midwest lives because Canada allows water to flow. American manufacturing thrives because Canada maintains shared resources. American agriculture survives because Canadian water policy prioritizes cooperation over confrontation, at least for now. Because Carney's Davos speech made something unmistakably clear. The old world order, where great powers dictated terms and middle powers complied, is over. Canada is charting a new path. One where sovereignty matters more than maintaining relationships that no longer serve Canadian interests. Trump can threaten tariffs. He can talk about annexation. He can withdraw invitations to international boards. He can insult Canadian leaders publicly. But at the end of the day, when American cities turn on their taps, when American farms irrigate their crops, when American factories need cooling water, they're depending on a resource flowing through Canadian territory under Canadian control. And Canada just reminded everyone that when you threaten a country's sovereignty, when you treat allies as subordinates, when you assume dependence creates submission, you might discover the dependence runs the other direction. Trump wanted leverage. Canada had it all along. They just waited until Trump gave them a reason to use it. Water flows where gravity takes it, and in the Great Lakes, gravity flows through Canadian territory before reaching American cities. That's not rhetoric, that's geography, and geography is leverage. Trump cannot negotiate away. I'm curious what you think about this. Does Trump understand the position he's put America in? Can this relationship be reset? Or are we watching the beginning of a resource conflict that changes everything? Let me know in the comments what I'm missing.